There's a recent webinar with the New Zealand Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, where we learned that when it comes to climate change, policymakers need to be more supportive of New Zealand farmers. Dr. Frank Mitloehner, a professor of air quality specialising at the Cooperative Extension for the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, presented at this webinar, and he joins us now. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for taking the time to join us here in Sarah's Country. Some very encouraging words to New Zealand farmers, telling the policymakers here to sit up and pay more attention, because farmers going out of business does not help the climate change matter, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. And I think that the farming sector is one to pay particular attention to, because farmers can be a very important part of the solution of a changing climate.
And so therefore, when it comes to being incentivized to do a good job, what were some of your suggestions that you outlined?
Look, our legislature here in California came up with a goal of reducing methane by 40%, 40% to be achieved by the year 2030. And at first, everybody was up in arms about that, thinking this could never be done. But the legislature did something quite smart. They used, instead of the normal stick approach of using rules, regulations, and fines, they decided to go the incentive approach, the carrot approach. And they dispersed $500 million to partner with the livestock sector in buying and purchasing technologies that can reduce methane. And it started a few years ago. Our farmers already have done so, meaning reduced methane by 25%. So we already have of where we want to be with our 40% goal, and that has been achieved by working in partnership.
When it comes to the science, and I think a lot of the arguments and debates I'm hearing here in New Zealand is around what particular calculation and method is being used. When it comes to the scenario you're talking about, what modelling and science are you working from?
So one of the biggest challenges is that up until now, many governments in the world treat methane as if it were to behave just like CO2, like a so-called long-lived climate pollutant. But that's not correct, because methane, in contrast to CO2, is not just produced, but methane is also naturally destroyed. And the fact that it's destroyed, this process called oxidation, is not taken into consideration. But it must be if you want to do correct accounting. Because then you would find that the amount of methane produced and the amount of methane naturally destroyed are roughly in balance. A constant herd of cattle, for example, will not add to additional, and that's important, additional methane and hence additional warming. If you manage to reduce methane, then you can actually induce negative warming, which is a fancy word for cooling. And that's really what we want. Now, methane is a challenge overall. It is a potent greenhouse gas, but you know what? You can turn it into an opportunity, because if you incentivize its reduction, then it can help cool our planet. So livestock can contribute to actively pulling carbon out of the air. And if now some of your viewers or listeners think that I have lost my marbles, the same is true for governments incentivizing the planting of trees on farms. Why would these governments do that? They do that because trees suck carbon out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis, and that reduces warming. So the same thing is true when you reduce methane. You're actively pulling carbon out of the air, and that's what we should incentivize.
It's certainly a hard ask when it's a great story to tell about reducing animal agriculture, the words that are repeated by climate change protesters, particularly in the States, and to be able to get the level of detail and understanding of that, and that what you're suggesting is not simply creative accounting, must be a hard sell.
It is not creative accounting at all. It is looking at the biogeochemical processes and then using what's possible to our greatest advantage. And that with that, I don't mean the farmers, but I mean society's advantage. We can actually use agriculture and forestry, which are the only two sectors of society that don't just produce, but also destroy greenhouse gases, and further incentivize the latter, namely the destruction of methane by, for example, using feed additives in cattle, or by using certain manure management strategies that help us reduce methane. It's absolutely possible. Let's use our farmers as partners and have them help us to counteract some of the fossil fuel emissions that we really need to get under control. By ramping up methane destruction, we can do that.
What are some of those things that are tangibly progressing well with science in feed additives and manure management, as you mentioned, that we can share with our viewers and listeners that they can start to get their head around implementing?
So here in California, we started out policy-wise by incentivizing manure methane reductions, the generations of so-called anaerobic digesters, the covering of the lagoons where the manure is stored is incentivized, and that prevents these gases from going into the atmosphere. So we are now trapping them under tar, and then we're taking these gases and referred to as biogas, and we convert the biogas into what's called RNG, renewable natural gas. And this RNG is a fuel type. So you trap the biogas on, let's say, a dairy, so that gas is now not going to the air, it's trapped, and convert it into vehicle fuel. So we are now taking biogas from dairies, we are converting it to vehicle fuel, putting it into semi-trucks, and now we no longer have to burn diesel with these trucks, we are burning the biogas-derived RNG. And that is the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And when I say carbon negative, I mean overall you're reducing carbon by doing so. And this is incentivized like nothing else out here. California is incentivizing this conversion of biogas into RNG dramatically with so-called low carbon fuel standard credits. There are some dairies that make more money by selling these credits than they would by selling their milk.
Wow.
And then on the other hand, you have research, such as the ones we do here at UC Davis, into feed additives. And we are finding that the so-called enteric emissions, meaning the methane that's belched out by animals, by cattle, let's say, can be reduced by anywhere between 10 to 40%. And some of those technologies involve new molecules like the so-called 3-NOP. Others are essential oils or seaweed. There's a whole list of additives. It's not a very long list, but it's a list, I would say, of 5 ingredients that I have worked with and my colleagues here at UC Davis that we have found to be very effective. So they reduce methane. The question now is, who's paying for it? Who is paying for that reduction? Is the public willing to take up some of that or not?
Yeah, and that is my question around that is for policymakers, as you are calling to utilise farmers as a partner in this climate change mission. Policymakers, it's very easy to just have a blanket ETS which goes on stock units, numbers of livestock run on a property, regardless of the management and the genetics of those animals.
Well, in my opinion, that really makes no sense. So, for example, here in the United States, we used to have 25 million dairy cows in the entire country, 25. Today, that was back in 1950. Today, we only have 9 million. So we went from 25 million dairy cows to now 9 million. But with this much smaller herd today, we have increased milk production by 60%. So we went from 25 million to 9 million dairy cows, but with this much smaller herd, we are producing 60% more milk. That means the carbon footprint of a liter of milk has decreased by 2/3. So it's very clear, it's not about cow numbers, cattle numbers. It's about efficiencies. And people have a hard time understanding efficiencies when it comes to livestock. They understand it much better when it comes to fuel efficiency of their car. If I tell someone your fuel efficiency, the efficiency of your car is much better today than the one that your parents' car had or your grandparents' car. All three were able to drive 100 kilometers, but your parents' or grandparents' car needed way more gas for that. And way more gas needed means way more emissions blown into the air. The same is true for livestock. Our livestock today is drastically more efficient than it used to be. The efficiency of emissions or the efficiency of production in New Zealand is much, much higher than that in many other countries of the world. If you were to drive your farmers out of New Zealand, that slack would be picked up by other countries in the world that have much less efficiency and therefore higher emissions. And this is a process called leakage, meaning you're losing hundreds or so farmers, and the production they normally would have put out will be picked up by other people who are less efficient and greater emitters. And that overall doesn't do anything to our climate other than making it worse. Because guess what? A greenhouse gas molecule of methane or so does not care where it's emitted. It cares that it's emitted. So let's produce these kind of things like meat and milk and eggs and so forth in the places of the world where we do it best.
Oh, Dr. Frank Mitloehner from the University of California in the Department of Animal Science there, Professor in Air Quality, joining us following the New Zealand Roundtable Sustainable Beef webinar, which you can check out the hour-long webinar at newzealandsustainablebeef.co.nz and search Rethinking Methane. But of course, it's also covered in a Farmers Weekly article you can get online, Farmers Need Incentive, GHG Experts Says, brought thanks to Annette Scott's article in last week's Farmers Weekly.
This is Sarah's Country.